Hello everybody, it's Jabrayson here with a new Let's Play of Dominions 5. This one's as LATC, the Barbarian Kings. So LATC is a faction with relatively expensive mages, one very good troop, and a few issues in the later game. So Mounted Scout is our scout. He doesn't have any survivals, but he does have 20 map move, which is often at least as good. A General, who's good at doing what he does. A Khan, who is recruitable outside of forts and comes with a pillager bonus. This allows them to use the raid order without any specialised equipment. They have 2 recruitment points rather than 1 due to their enhanced leadership. So they do take a couple of turns to come out, but they are very much worth it. And due to the newer way that resources in provinces are calculated, like turn by turn, when you're recruiting in provinces where you don't have quite enough resources, these guys are actually in a better position than they used to be for recruiting, because previously you'd sometimes be in a position where it would take 3 turns to come out just due to the finicky way that resources stacked up, but now that's pretty rare. In JBBM, these guys have 1d3 Eagles, which are the same as Falcon, which is a little bit nerfed compared to vanilla, but still useful kind of lance bait and can potentially mess up assassins a little bit. In terms of the priests, they've got a Ceremonial Master. This guy's just cheap, there's nothing remotely redeeming about him. A Master of the Way, which for LATC as well as ENMA is a slightly expensive mage for what they can do, but they're what you have, so it's what you have to work with. Early in the game, they're just useful as, well, they just aren't useful, that's the truth, but people are often tempted to buy them because of their researchability. Kind of mid-game and later game, they can potentially be useful with a bit of magic, but just due to their path layout and the cost at 135 gold, they always just feel really expensive for what you want them to do. Ancestor Smiths are some of our better, early on at least, mages. So due to the fact they've got Earth 2, that means they have guaranteed access to Legions of Steel. It also means they have guaranteed access to Strength of Giants. Also means they have access to Earth Meld, although that's often quite hard to pull off in practice in Dominions 5 compared to 4. They also have these paths as a kind of additional supplement to their to the base magic. Now, with a Earth and Air path, you can forge a piece of gear called the Armor of 5 Elements, and this is a very good piece of equipment for pretty much any commander of any size. It's low encumbrance, low map move penalty, and gives you +5 to most, if not all, elemental resistances. Well worth buying, and it's only 4 gems, 3 made by these guys. Spirit Masters are kind of another mid-game oriented commander rather than, I would say, an early one. Reason for that is that if they roll E, they can cast Strength of Gaia, which then allows them to cast Howl. So Strength of Gaia is at Construction 4, it's +1n, and Regen Bugskin +4 Strength. Those bits don't matter, but this bit does. So you can cast Howl with them. It's a little bit risky because they're, although their base hit points are higher than a standard human at 14, even for an old guy, you do run the risk of giving them afflictions, like anyone who casts relatively high fatigue magic. Ancestor Guides are your go-to mid-game mages. Reason for this is that they have the ability to cast Wailing Winds and Winds of Death pretty easily, and the ones that have 2A are actually useful for doing this with Cloud Trees. In the magic phase, for example, if you know someone is putting together a stack with a relatively bad commander, just with like the Whip of Command, so often guys will gateway in onto a friendly lab, but with some guy like, you know, an Arcus Kefalon Mystic or something, the guys will be like -3 morale. Well, if you can hit them with an Ancestor Guide with this and just rout the whole lot of them, you can cause immense casualties, which is great. It's really convenient. Celestial Masters are at their weakest in LA. They don't have any access to death, they don't have any access to fire. The reason that matters is that although air magic is relatively strong and to some extent buffed in Dominions 5 compared to 4 by the addition of stun on lightning damage, you could really use some AN damage which isn't air typed. especially against forces like Atlantis, which I'll give them a sec. So go over to Atlantis. These guys are like pretty much your main foe, I think, really in LA as TC, for a couple of reasons. One is that the unsleeping are very good versus cavalry due to the poison barbs, and two, because these guys are quite hard to take out without also endangering your own forces. But if you had some air and magic, like Sulphur Haze or whatever, completely different story. But because you're fighting them with often reduced but still relatively high protection, they can be quite a tough fight. So Forgiving Fathers, if they roll E, are very capable of casting stuff like Legions of Steel on these guys, so the ice protection is nullified to some extent if it's giving a penalty in your dominion. Anyway, to go back to the specifics of TC, their troop loadout is pretty standard. JBBM, most TC troops cost 9 rather than 10. It does make a huge difference, but it's a little something. Heavy footmen are only really useful for catching arrows, but to be fair, you have Barbarian Heavy Horsemen for that, and these guys don't move at snail's pace. Your cavalry are really the high point of the faction, so the Barbarian Horseman is pretty okay. They have a good light lance for repelling attacks. They've got 11 attack skill, and it's on par with a spear, so that does allow them to, for example, repel greatsword attacks, which can come in handy against quite a lot of the factions. But the real highlight is the Barbarian Heavy Horseman, who has some of everything in terms of damage. So the lance is going to do up to 28 damage without Strength of Giants on them, at which point it can be all the way up to 32. And they're just generally very, very dangerous. The only mistake people really make with them is leaving them unscripted, at which point you have a composite bow, although you kind of have a similar situation to fighting horse-trap cavalry, where people come in, they've been a little peppered by arrows, and then all of a sudden they get smashed for about, 30-40 damage, and just the front line just disintegrates on contact, which is quite a happy thing when it happens. But overall, I would typically use these guys on attack rear rather than kind of waiting for anyone to approach, because they are quite vulnerable to magic, although they are very good in kind of mundane fights. Due to their full scale armor, half helmet and shield, they don't have a particularly high resource cost at only 27, but this actually provides better armor in relative terms than, for example, if we go to Aleaco Scuffalo. They're a game of cavalry that I would say are pretty good value, are much higher res cost, and actually a little bit weaker. So Plate Cuirass has an abnormally high R cost, as it's called in the game, for what they do, and also the recruitment points are way higher. I mean, if you go to Man, you're in a not dissimilar situation with Tar Knights. Again, 51 res, 40 gold, 46. For a unit that's basically comparable, you lose out on a couple of points proc compared to Knights of Man, but it's nothing huge. But yeah, so these guys are the main kind of striking arm of the faction. 14 map move, relatively low ank, good attack skill, reasonable defense skill, and yeah, just a great unit. They also all come with Pillager, so if led by a Khan, you can raid enemy provinces, which can cause absolutely immense devastation, but that's more of a niche thing. And then your Ancestor Vessels are your Cap-only Sacred. If you're on any other faction, you'd make loads of these. 32 res, 46 rec, just makes them a little bit kind of pricey compared to Barbarian Heavy Horse, but they do come with innate Spirit Sight. Got Pillager. The Howling Bow is an interesting but mainly ineffectual weapon. It's 1/3 of strength added, so it always comes out as 13, but the Lesser Fear, which is why people kind of always hope that it'll do really well for them, this is kind of a boondoggle. So it more or less procs a fear check if it pierces armor, but 13 damage is not a huge amount. I mean, that's when you factor in the pierce penalty to prot, you're looking at like kind of 15-16 prot, averaging it out, which in an era with quite a lot of shields and relatively heavy armor doesn't happen as often as you'd like, so it's a little bit unrealistic for breaking lines just through that. But they are all sacred and they're okay. But yeah, early on, Barbarian Heavy Horse are your main unit. Now in terms of spells, you have access to some but not all of the same stuff as the ATC. So you have Call Ancestor, that's come back after MA. and you also have access to Wrath of the Ancestors. Now in JBBM, this is a reduced number of ghosts compared to the base game, although if you communion up, it can actually be a little bit higher. But this is basically just a way to make Wrath of the Ancestors less dominant on EATC and Soromatia, that also kind of has an effect on how LATC plays. You don't have the Demons of Heavenly Fire or Rivers. You do have Celestial Hounds, although I've never ever made one, and Celestial Soldiers, which was recently reduced in price in JBVM, so it's 10 gems rather than, I think it was 15, which was a little bit high. In terms of your main magic early, so again we're looking at like Strength of Giants, which in JBVM costs an Earth Gem, and Legions of Steel, which once again does. So the reason this is the case is because a lot of the factions, including LATC, that use Earth magic as a battle magic, also have some kind of way to reduce their expenditure of Earth gems through their forges. So I thought, you know what, at the end of the day, Earth should be a tiny bit inconvenient to use. So that's a big change I made. Later in the game, we're probably going more into evocation, doing stuff like Wailing Winds, doing stuff like Wind of Death, which for the faction typically does require the use of Skull Staffs, but by the time they come out, because of the nature of your research being relatively expensive, it's almost plays like a giant nation in that respect. It's kind of relatively expensive, but the numbers are quite high per mage. You tend not to get huge amounts of research out at any time relative to, you know, the strongest of the era. So you're not LA Marignon, or certainly not Begarus, but yeah, you do sort of okay. So if we go to our Pretender of the faction, that's this guy. Now this is a kind of Pretender that I would almost never take, but LATC, because of the requirements of the faction and because of the relatively small pool of gods that they have available with nature, this is kind of what I had to settle on. So he's Imprisoned. Again, probably the first time I've played with an Imprisoned God in a multiplayer game. I almost always go for an awake monster of some kind. But the faction just doesn't really stand up that well without a few resistances here and there. So we have Major Fire, Shock, Cold, and Poison Res. We also have Magic Res. In terms of the other stuff, we have Larger, which is useful both as a Imprisoned Map Move Bless. So it grants you +2 map move, which is always useful, and also grants some additional strength to, you know, anyone who ends up in a fight, which sometimes your mages do end up in a fight, so that's just the way of it. The Undying and Withering Weapons are largely for ghosts, because Withering Weapons does give you some way to damage pretty much all targets in the game and potentially cause afflictions if nothing else. And the Undying is there so that if they get repelled, they take less of a, well, there is less chance of dying immediately, basically. Now, the use of Ghosts and the use of Larger Bless is somewhat unusual, if not incompatible. It's just because the spacing on the Ghosts is basically reduced from being 6 per square to 3 per square. Now, that's not a huge problem in LA because your strategy is much less dependent on them than in EA. And I thought with the old mages, this seemed like a reasonably good way to do it. Taking Undying is also a possibility nowadays to reduce some of the map move issues, but just because of how scales tight the faction is, that didn't really feel like an option. You know, I could have gone Death 2 and Magic 1, but I think I'd rather go for a bit of growth. And in JBBM, Drain is and Magic are lessened back to kind of Dom Force kind of scale, where 2 points gives you 1 and 3 points gives you 2 RP. So I basically made that change as a way to kind of lengthen the mid game, and also to make Magic in general less of a dominant scale, because much like Growth, which is also nerfed, it was too much of an easy pick, basically. And it also really dissuaded taking the obverse scale as well. Anyway, I hope that helps. Theoretically, this guy should come out year 3 sometime. He'll be ready to cast any of the nature globals, because 5 plus Astral also means that he can forge a Moonvine relatively easily. could even potentially cast Celestial Rainbow if the game goes really, really late. Also grants us access to, the Earth globals, and depending on how things shake out, also could be a guy who can make the Stuff Elemental Mastery, the fire and water one, because those boosts are relatively easy once you hit Con 6, and you can make a Skull of Fire alongside a water bracelet. But we'll see how it goes, and thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.